All right, now let's take a look at the client-side implementation. So in client app folder, components, here we have this patient folder. This is our template. Pretty basic. It doesn't have anything fancy. And I have covered all that you see here in my beginner's Angular course. But let me briefly highlight a couple of things here. So we have this div with the class form group, which is just basic Bootstrap. It encapsulates a label and an input field. So here's our label. Below that, we have a div for rendering validation errors. Now this div is for rendering validation errors that come from the server. So in ngIf directive, we call the get method of the form, pass the name of our control, in this case name, and check if it's valid or not. If it's not valid, we render the error. And to get the error, once again, we call form.get to get our control object, and then we call getError to get the remote validation error. I will show you where that remote is set in a second. So this is the pattern I have used throughout this HTML markup. Now let's take a look at the component. So here we have a field called form, which is of type form group. And in the constructor, we're injecting a form builder and a patient service. We use patient service to talk to our API. So here we're not going to use the HTTP service. And this is for proper separation of concerns, because talking to the backend is a different responsibility, and we shouldn't add it in our components. That's why all of that is encapsulated in patient service. Let me quickly show you patient service. So a very basic service. In the constructor, we inject Angular HTTP service, and here we have only one save method. So we simply call http.post and return the result to the caller, which is in this case an observable object. Now back in our component, in the constructor, we use the form builder to build our form. So once again, this is pretty basic. I've covered all this in my beginner's Angular course, but briefly you can see that our form has a name property, an address, which is a group with two properties, street and city, and medications, which is an array. So this is our form object. Now let's take a look at the save method. So we call the save method of our patient service and pass this.form.value. This will return the JSON object behind our form. Now we subscribe to this observable. If the response is successful, we simply log it on the console. Otherwise, we get the errors, and then we need to programmatically apply them to the controls in this form. And this is the tricky part of this implementation. So let's see what's happening here. First, we're iterating in our errors object. So here's an example of our errors object. In each iteration, we get one property. So in the first iteration, we get name, and in the second iteration, we get address.street. Now on this line, I'm calling this.form.get to get the corresponding control in the form. But as an argument to the get method, I'm not supplying key here. Because as I explained earlier, ASP.NET Core is not properly applying camel case to this property. So here, S should not be capital, it should be lowercase. That's why I pass this key to this function I have created, normalize camel case. And I'm going to show you how that works in a second. So this is a temporary fix for the bug in ASP.NET Core. Okay, now we have the control. Then we call the setErrors method to apply an error to this control object. The name of the error is remote, and that's what I was using in our template. Now for the actual error, I'm getting the value of the key property in our errors object. So this is the value. You can see in our errors object, the value of each key is an array. So I'm using the join method to concatenate all these errors. And this is how you bring server-side validation errors to Angular. So it's really not that complicated, it's just a little bit tricky. Okay, and finally, let's take a look at our add medication method. This method is called when we type something here and click this button. So first I'm checking if the input has a value or not. If not, we return. Then we use this.form.get medications to get that control object. Now this method returns an abstract control, but our medications control is actually an array. So look in the constructor. This is how we created our form. Medications is an array. So back here, we get the medications array. Now this array is an array of complex objects. So here we call this .formBuilder.group to create a new group, and this group has one property or one field, name, and the value of this field is what the user typed in our text box. So here we have a new medication object, and then we push it in our medications array. Very, very simple. And finally, we clear our text box. So this is all the code behind this patient form. Now, one last thing. In the patient folder, look at this patient module. Here I have declared 3 interfaces that mimic the server-side models. So we have medication with a name property, address with street and city, and patient with these 3 properties. Do we need this? Not really. You would need these interface declarations only if you're going to explicitly work with the patient object and you want to have IntelliSense or you want to have compile time checking. But in our patient component, nowhere we have explicitly used a patient object. Here we're building a form, and Angular would automatically create a patient object under the hood. The structure of that patient object is like what we define here, and this is not related to this patient interface here. This is a common misconception that some developers think because they have a patient class on the server with these properties, they need to create this class on the client as well. It's really not necessary, it's just redundant. And to prove this, if you go to patient component, on the top you can see I've commented out the line where I'm importing medication and patient. So whether we have this code or not, it doesn't really matter. So that's all about the client-side implementation. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and thank you for watching.